Today on the Cameron Journal podcast, we are joined by B.R. Bates. She is the author of The Crack City Strangler, The Homicides of Serial Killer Benjamin Atkins. This takes place in fabulous Detroit. This is the second book in the series, and the description is so good. In this gripping narrative, award-winning journalist B.R. Bates delves into the twisted life of Benjamin Tony Atkins, whose reign of terror in Detroit spanned less than a year in the early 1990s. Known for targeting vulnerable women in Detroit's most dangerous neighborhoods, Atkins attacked at least 12 women along a mile-and-a-half stretch of Woodward Avenue, one of the city's most iconic streets. So, if you love true crime podcasts, all this sort of thing, we're diving into it once again this week with this fabulous story. So, welcome to the Cameron Journal podcast.
Thank you. It's good to be
Yeah,
here.
thank you. So, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and the book?
Well, I am a longtime writer. I'm only recently writing in true crime the past few years with these two books and the Murders in the Motor City series. I spent a lot of my career writing completely different things. I've written some novels, I've written a whole host of pop culture reference books, I refer to them, but basically books about classic TV shows that I love. So, really concentrated a lot of my writing career in the entertainment area, TV mainly, and just had an interest in more in true crime. And I love watching like Dateline and Forensic Files and anything on the ID channel and all that stuff. And so was introduced to a retired Detroit cop who had thought that a serial killer case that he worked in Detroit in the late 90s, early 2000s would always make a good book project, and had intended to write the book himself. But we had a mutual friend who introduced us because our mutual friend knew that I had an interest in true crime. And so it just went from there. So got diverted to a different in my career, and I've really enjoyed the research since then. But yeah, I'm a journalist at heart. I spent 10 years in the daily newspaper business. 5 of them were at the Detroit News in Detroit, and that's where I worked at the time of one of the cases that I researched, and spent time in the corporate area as well, a little bit of time in ministry. So I've been in all different sectors. I manage websites for in the government sector, federal government sector right now. So I've done a little bit of everything over the years, but always doing my writing projects on the side throughout my career.
No, that's quite impressive, and that's an interesting story. You know, that's a good movie opening. Cop wants to write book about old serial killer case. Writer arrives to help. That's a solid 10 minutes for a movie right there.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it's so yeah. Tell us a little bit about this case and why it's fascinating.
Benjamin Atkins is a different sort of serial killer. You know, there's been so many different serial killers in the public eye over the years. And I like to think that maybe the 1980s, even the 70s and the 90s were like the heyday of serial killers. And maybe we don't hear about them quite as often, at least new ones popping up these days because of technology, advances in forensic science and all of that. Uh, but he operated in the early 1990s. He killed in Detroit in 1991 and 1992. And on the surface, I think people have known him by his, I guess, claim to fame he was given at the time of his arrest for being the country's fastest serial killer, because he did kill 11 women in a span of a few months, really. Essentially, it could have been as little as 6 months and maybe 7 or 8 months. So he was known for that back then, and he was known to kill sex workers on Woodward Avenue. Right. It was pretty much what he was known for. But as I attacked this case and did the research, I found out some fascinating things about him, particularly in the psychiatric evaluations he had after his arrest and in his lead up to trial, and discovered that he had claimed to hear voices. He was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. He seemed to have alternate personality claimed living within him. But then beyond that, beyond the psychology aspect of this, there's really his upbringing, which when you learn more about this case and more of what he faced as a child growing up, he had a heroin addicted, self-admitted heroin mom who worked the streets as a sex worker herself and was largely absent through his childhood. He had no dad. And so the circumstances that he grew up with, I think, make him also a unique serial killer. So there's all kinds of aspects that you can look at in this case that I find fascinating, and I think other people would too.
Hmm. Yes, I think it's interesting that I think it is rather interesting how, well, one, this all took place in what, a mile and a half on Woodward Avenue.
Very small area, yes.
Yeah, it doesn't get too far from home. Unlike some of his friends like Zodiac or the Green River, who were all over the place and sort of thing. So you could have saved yourself just by avoiding that little section of road. Weirdly enough, that yeah, there definitely seems to be a lot of in contrast to many of the other famous ones, this guy had some genuine issues and problems in his life.
Yes, yeah. He and his brother, he had a older brother, just 1 year older, and the two of them were together through their childhoods. They were always together. And mom, like I said, largely absent, sometimes there, sometimes not. But at some point when they were real young, like 4 or 5 years old, they were placed in the care of the county. They became wards of the government and they were placed into foster homes. And they went through a few different foster homes. And then they were placed in a home for boys when Benjamin was about 10 years old. And they spent 2 years there. And then they were discharged back to their mom's care. And along that road, it was a pretty rocky road. There were a lot of
Yeah.
difficulties. There was abuse, and there was their own, when they were in the foster homes, there was their own misbehavior, I guess you'd call it. The two boys were skipping school, they were breaking into buildings. So there was a lot of early trouble. One of the gals at one of the foster homes said that Benjamin was setting fires, which is one of our red
Yeah.
flags that we're very familiar with serial killers. So there were just a lot of things happening in Benjamin's life that led him along this path. And it was a young life when he was arrested. He was only 23, but it was definitely marked with a lot of trauma leading up to that point.
Yeah, which is kind of different from some of the other ones that had very normal middle class upbringings with not a lot of issue. It's kind of like this one's kind of like, well, if you look at the background, it's, kind of amazing. More people don't go down this road sort of thing. But not terribly, terribly so surprising. Um, what was the news coverage like at the time?
We have two big newspapers in Detroit, the Detroit News and the Detroit Free Press, and they covered it pretty heavily leading up to his arrest. Um, their daily newspapers, broadsheet, and then there's always the other publications around Metro Detroit or in Michigan, and definitely the news on TV covered it as well. It got some pretty good coverage, especially leading up to his arrest, because that was the mystery of it all. Police knew at a certain point, really in February of 1992, when three women were discovered in the Monterey Motel on the same day. That really broke things wide open. And so police realized, okay, we have a serial killer. We can't deny it. We've got to let the public know too. And there was a lot of outcry in the public, and that was covered pretty well in the news as well, because another issue coming into this is the state of abandoned buildings in Highland Park, where 8 of the women were killed, and in Detroit, where 3 of the women were killed. So Highland Park is within Detroit. It's completely surrounded by Detroit, and it's centered on Woodward Avenue, and it's a very small city. Um, so 8 of the cases happened there on, like you said, like a mile and a half stretch of Woodward Avenue. And so this was big for Highland Park because they didn't really get the murder rate that Detroit had at the time. And so there was a lot of public fear of just like anybody being on Woodward Ave, not just women who were living at risk on the street already doing sex work, but anybody being on Woodward. Parents were concerned with their kids walking around there in the neighborhoods. So there was a lot of media coverage of that. The cops who worked the case that I interviewed for the book complained a little bit about the news coverage, like the TV news coverage. One particular officer, he was the one who was in charge of the case for Highland Park Public Safety. Jim Dobson is his name. He has since passed on. Actually, he just died about a year ago. Um, he said that there was one particular high profile TV reporter who he was friends with who followed him around pretty relentlessly. So there was
Yeah.
a lot of attention in the media on catching this unknown assailant. And then once he was apprehended, he was identified, there was a swarm of media coverage on anybody who knew him as a kid or knew him around town, or let's talk to his neighbors and his family members or anybody who knew him, to try to shed light on this newly arrested suspect. And so there was some coverage then, but I think going up to the trial, which was in 1994. He was arrested in August 1992, and then he was tried in January 1994. And in that year and a half or so, there was a waning interest. That was a little concerning too. By the time the trial happened, there wasn't near age that there had been before.
No, that's very interesting. Well, I imagine it being the early '90s and kind of the real peak of the whole "it bleeds, it leads" evening TV news reporting. This sort of story
Mm-hmm.
was a real gift to the local TV news stations. So
I'm
it's yeah,
sure.
that I'm sure got very annoying for all parties involved. So, let's talk a little bit about process. Research. What's your method? What's your process? How did it all come together?
I usually start with trying to reach people. I also FOIA for whatever file I can get my hands on, fill out lots of FOIA requests with whatever agency was in any way involved in this. So that's this whole separate thing. But first, because I know it takes a lot of time to find people and to get them to respond, that's another aspect of it. I usually start out with searching for people, and that's the funnest part to me. And Facebook is like the number one tool I use to find people, unfortunately, because people reveal so much on Facebook. Um, but generally, researching each one of the women who encountered Atkins, that's where I started. Also, in reaching any of his family members who might still be around, which was very difficult. His mom has passed. It really came down to his brother, who I think I reached, but just could not get a response from. Any other siblings, which we do believe he does have siblings. They're in the wind. Who knows even who they are or where they are? So it really came down to reaching his brother and then finding him first. But each one of the women who were killed, I set out with the goal on both of these book projects of finding at least one person to speak for each one of the females who were killed, and even trying to find survivors. I came across another survivor for Atkins, which was really quite interesting because he had a known survivor at the time. And then there was someone who posted online about encountering him, and I was able to reach her and interview her and vet, basically what she was telling me, and was convinced that her story was valid. And so it included her in the book also. So it makes you wonder how many other survivors are out there. But yeah, I think as far as process, number one, finding people to interview, cops who worked the case as well. This is a 30-plus-year-old case. So a lot of these officers are not around. And believe it or not, 3 of the police officers I interviewed have since passed on, which is very unsettling. But one just died a couple months ago, and it was just so nice. And I got to interview him a few times, like 3 or 4 times actually, about the case. But so finding people, and then the FOIA requests. And then when you get the files, like you look for the files, you got Highland Park and you got Detroit, you got the Wayne County Morgue, you got any, like I said, any agency that touched this case. Michigan State Police worked the case too. So you FOIA the files, and then you dig into the files and you see where they lead you, because they might lead you in different directions. You maybe also search some court records, not just the trial of Atkins, but some of the other people involved in the case, like even some of these ladies working in the streets. they had some court records too. So you dig around in there and you try to get a picture of each one of those gals too. So it leads you in a lot of directions, but I always emphasize the aspect of finding people. And then sometimes, like when it comes to a victim family member, a sister or a child of one of the women who were killed, you send a message and then you have to let it sit there because they may not see it for one thing. But also, once they see it, I think sometimes they really have to think about it. I think if I were in their shoes, I'd be like, why should I talk to this person? I don't know this person, you know? And it's a traumatic thing to have a family member who's killed by a serial killer, especially one that was in the news, splashed all over the news. So I totally understand when I don't get a response. And a lot of the time, I don't get a response. And so, you have to take that in stride as well.
No, that is 110% true. Whatever happened to Atkins, the criminal? I gather he probably, at least at minimum, went to prison.
Yes, he did. He was convicted in 1994 spring. I think it was April when the verdicts were reached. And he was convicted in just about everything, almost every charge they put against him, which was 11 murders and different charges on each murder. And then the assault of the one survivor. So he was convicted of just about everything. He was incarcerated in Michigan and he died only 3 years later, September 1997. He died in prison. He had HIV/AIDS.
Oh, I see.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's yeah, that is a ignominious end to an ignominious career.
Mm-hmm.
That's very, 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 very kind of fascinating. Um, w- as far as, different cases like this go and all this sort of thing, besides, location, is there anything kind of odd that makes this case stand out in terms of his methods, who he targeted, anything kind of a bit weird or odd? Because these cases are always so quirky.
I think in Atkins' case, he was known to, a couple of the cops who worked the case told me he killed his mom over and over and over. So, really, that's what he set out to do
Mm,
from a psychological perspective. He
mm.
had an interesting relationship with his mom. He loved his mom very much. When he was a little boy and he was at the home for boys, the social workers, they were actually nuns. The home was run by the Catholic archdiocese. And so it was the sisters who were the ones who were assessing him, doing the reporting on him while he was staying at the home for boys. And so they would note in their report how he missed his mom. Sometimes his mom would come to visit. Sometimes she would say she was coming to visit and she wouldn't show up. And so he got stood up, I guess you'd say. And that was, I think, difficult for him. He always, one of the psychiatrists who evaluated him after his arrest noted that he and his brother and his mom were his ideal circle. No matter what his mom did, she was out on the street, she was doing drugs. She took him along when she was meeting with Johns, which was significant. He was actually witnessing her meeting with Johns. So that was a big, huge trauma in his childhood, too. No matter what she did, he always wanted to be reunited with her. Like while he was at the home, he wanted the three of them back together. That was what was important to him. And so, despite that, despite his love for his mom that he even expressed after he was arrested in Detroit, he told the interrogating officer, Ron Sanders, he said, "Don't tell my mom about this, okay?" Which seems so absurd, but I think he was totally honest when he said it. Like he didn't want his mom to know that they were questioning him for these murders in Highland Park in Detroit. Um,
Wow.
so he had this love for her. He even told her in court when, at one point, when they saw each other in court, "I love you, mama." So there was that, but yet he sought her out in each one of these females on Woodward Ave. He stuck to a type. He did not attack any white woman or Hispanic woman or Asian woman. every single, and there was diversity on the streets. I can assure you there's diversity on the streets of Detroit in the sex work. He sought a Black female who was addicted to drugs, and he lured her with drugs, and as the cops said, he was killing his mother over and over. And John Douglas, the FBI profiler, has said in books and I think in interviews that a lot of these serial killers have mommy issues. Even the ones who aren't killing their mom over and over and over, who don't attack a female who's just like their mom, um, they still have some unresolved issues with their mother. And so in Atkins' case, this evidently was really the case in that he sought a particular type to kill. Now, his MO was pretty common as far as serial killers go. He strangled, he manually strangled. And so it was the same every time. He found this particular type of female. He lured into an abandoned place in Highland Park or Detroit along Woodward Ave. They smoked, got a little high together, and then things went sideways, and he would strangle and rape her, and often rape her after he had strangled her and she had passed out. Sometimes she would wake up again. So it was a pretty gory picture, but really the same MO every time. But I think that that aspect with his mom of choosing the type of his mom makes him a little unique too. And it's very unsettling.
Well, yeah, and there's kind of just such an explicit, explicit tie to be kind of like, oh yeah, this. I think the thing about this case kind of odd, it all kind of adds up a little bit. Like, oh yeah, that all kind of, that's what we would anticipate, sort of thing, out of this, which is a bit odd. It's not a, a big surprise, like some of the other more famous cases, sort of thing. This is kind of like, yeah, I could totally see why this guy went down this road. Like, 2 + 2 = 4. So I think that is quite interesting. How long did it take to write the book?
I think between 2 and 3 years, you set out the initial research, like trying to find people. You let that percolate for a while. Then you work on the files. You do your interviews of anybody that you can find. And I follow a process where I also have anybody that I interviewed review their material in a draft of the book before anything ever goes to print. And so I would say probably about 3 years. Let me see, it's 2025, 2022. Yeah, that could have been about when I started this. The first book, I think it took a little bit longer with maybe 4 or 5 years, but the second book, I did not take quite as long at.
Yeah, no. No, that's really cool that you let people review ahead of time and all that sort of thing. What gets words on the page for you? What gets you writing stuff down?
I think learning about the victims. I really,
Mm,
I really have related to them in certain ways because I'm about the age that they would be if they were still alive. In both of the cases, actually, the Armstrong case and the Atkins case, a lot of these females, I'm about their age. I'm of the same generation, and so I really could relate to them. They struck a chord with me because a lot of these women, they started out their own childhoods in a very normal way. They had nuclear families. They had a mom and dad at home. They had a mom and dad with a good job providing for the family. They had stable upbringings, a lot of them. I guess people would find that surprising because we have the stereotype of the prostitute, of the sex worker. And it's unfortunate because, these women who are on the street, often, almost always, it's drug addiction that put them out there. And we have a high rate of addiction in our culture. A lot of us are addicted to different things. It doesn't have to be drugs. I think there's addiction very prevalent everywhere. But that's usually what brought these women to this point of living at risk on the street. And it really was a wrong turn or two in their lives that separate them from those of us who do not live on the streets. And so that was very meaningful to me to to learn about and inspiring of me. And that's why I start the book with a chapter on each one of those women, because I wanted to make it as victim centric as I could. And so that is inspirational. That's what motivates me.
Yeah, yeah. So and you I know that you mentioned that you usually work on book projects on Friday. What's your best writing environment? Lighting, music, in the dark.
I actually don't have any background noise if I'm writing. I
Hmm.
can't have any music on or anything. If I'm just looking, if I'm playing on, I call it playing, but literally, if I'm looking for, like for instance, as I said, the family members of a certain victim, and I'm trolling around online, I'm using my usual sites that have some good intel. I'm winding my way over to Facebook to look for family members, that kind of thing. I'll have something on in the background, maybe some music, or I listen to some preachers that I like. Joyce Meyer, I'm a big fan of Joyce Meyer, so um, but nothing that can really drag too much of my attention away. So I tend to favor silence with a lot of this work. And then I'm just working here in my office, and it's pretty quiet here. It's a walkout basement, so I live out in the country, so things are pretty quiet.
No, no, that's quite fantastic, and it's so good. I love your cover. It's very evocative.
Thank you. Yes. And I had nothing to do with that. That's a talented artist who drew that up in the publishing company, Wild Blue Press. It's very striking. And the two covers of the two books are the same format, exactly the same format, but different images and titles, of course. But yeah, I think it's very eye-catching, dramatic.
Yes, yes, yes. Well, it'll be good for the Netflix special. So it's
Right.
no, no, that's very good. What was the most surprising thing about this case?
Surprising. Probably the fact that the case files with Highland Park were lost. Highland Park, there is a movie called Highland Park that I do recommend to people. It's a comedy movie, and it was only made like, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago or something. Is a comedy movie, but it does reinforce the point that Highland Park is not a prosperous city in Michigan. It is a city that's been in dire financial straits over recent years. It went through prosperity in the early 1900s. Henry Ford built a new big plant there to produce the Model T. Chrysler was headquartered there for decades. And so it prospered with the auto industry and grew up with the auto industry, much like the Detroit around it. But then Henry Ford closed down that plant. Chrysler later left. And so, with that, it took away a lot of the good times from the city. And so, Highland Park has struggled financially in the past few decades. They had a police department and a fire department at one time. Then they merged the two into what they called a public safety. And at the time of this case, it was Highland Park Public Safety, meaning that cops could be out and be called to a fire to fight a fire, and firefighters could be answering a cop call. So it merged those two operations. And then the state took over financial management of the city at one point. And now, and then during those years that the state was in financial management of the city, there was no police department. And so now these days, there is a police department in Highland Park again, but it's waned and ebbed over the years. But I say all that to say that the case files for this Atkins case were lost. When I
Hmm.
went to FOIA, the Highland Park PD, they had lost all the files to the case. And when I dug into it a little bit, I discovered a couple French photographers who had traveled to the United States to photograph architecture, to photograph abandoned buildings, for one thing. And of course, they came to Detroit and they spent some time in Highland Park. And this was, oh gosh, early 2000s, I think. But they were in the building that used to house the Highland Park Public Safety. It was abandoned after sometime after this case, I think later in the 1990s, they moved locations to another building, but they did not move a lot of case files. And so these two French photographers took a little tour through this abandoned buildings, and they found these in the one building, they found these case files, and they looked like they were homicide case files, and they photographed them, and come to find out they were the Benjamin Atkins case files, and even vials of blood and samples. I mean, just all kinds of material from investigating the case. And they're right there in the photographs that the French photographers took. And so that was kind of shocking. I was able to obtain copies of those files from somewhere else. So
Yeah.
thankfully, I still had them. But just the idea that Highland Park has been through so much of its own turmoil over the years that these case files were lost. And even one of the cops, the officer in charge, Jim Dobson, who had just recently passed, he told me when I interviewed him, he said, yeah, we were always a little fearful of him doing an appeal, in those, well, the 3 years leading up to his death. He was trying to appeal to a certain point, but he didn't go very far. But he told me, gosh, we were afraid at one point he would find a judge sympathetic to his cause, and we'd be called back into court over this whole thing, and we had no files. So it was scary. I found that surprising. I had never come across that idea before, that the loss of these files. And not only were they lost, but they were documented lying on the floor of an abandoned building by a couple French photographers who had never even heard of the case. So that's a weird aspect of this case too. And it goes to illustrate the state of abandoned buildings in Highland Park, because it did have a very high number of abandoned buildings at the time of this case, 300 and some, in a very small city. And I think even still does to this day have quite a few abandoned structures that the folks in charge, I think, haven't quite known how to deal with or how to solve that issue.
Yeah, I mean, my opinion with a long time was like with Detroit, it's like stick a dynamite under it, blow it up and start over. There's like it's nothing. We need Robert Moses and some urban renewal. Immediately sort of thing. No, that's really cool, and with that, there's a very interesting quirk about the file system, some abandoned building, because the whole public apparatus of this town has kind of fallen apart. That's that's good. Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. Well, this has all been very interesting. I want to close on finding out where we can buy the book and keep up with you online.
Thank you. Yeah, the book is available on Amazon and all the usual places online. I have a website, brbates.com, and you could go and learn more about the books, find links to interviews such as this one. I've done a lot of interviews recently, and there's links to the different formats of the book on Amazon. It is in paperback and hardcover and Kindle/ebook at the moment. It is going to be in audio soon, maybe by the time this interview drops. So you'll have all those formats to choose from. So yeah, brbates.com. I'm on Instagram, I think at brbates.author. I'm on Pinterest. I'm in a few different places. I do a blog too. So check out the blog, because I have some content in the blog that is not in the book. Like for instance, we ran a few of the case photos in the book, but there's a lot of other photos I had access to that I'm going to be using in blog posts. So you'll get to see those. So thank you. And YouTube also.
Fascinating.
I'm on YouTube with a few different videos about the books.
No, fascinating. Absolutely perfect. Thank you so much for coming on the Cameron Journal podcast.
Thank you for the opportunity.
That's all for this episode of the Cameron Journal podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Visit us online at CameronJournal.com. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and I love to talk to my followers and listeners, so please feel free to get us on social media at Cameron Cowan on Twitter, and we'll see you next time on the Cameron Journal podcast.